I wanted to make a quick video on my X-E5 setup because I have it set up so differently than my full frame cameras. With my full frame cameras, I generally shoot aperture priority. Since I generally shoot landscapes and seascapes in the bright Hawaiian sunlight, I don't have to worry about the shutter speed being too slow or the ISO too high. Other than that, I adjust the shutter speed if I'm going for a particular effect. For instance, if I want to do a panning shot with a slow shutter, or a very high shutter to freeze motion. I have my Fujifilm set up a little differently though, for two reasons. First, I'm trying to mimic the one-hand operation that I enjoy with the Sony ZV-1. Second, when I'm shooting with my Fuji, I'm generally trying to have a little bit more fun by shooting straight JPEG, applying different sims, and trying different crops. Let's start in the front with this little lever. Those of us of a certain age know that this is made to mimic the self-timer of the old film cameras. So if you've never handled one before, to set the self-timer on those old film cameras, you used to have to wind this spring-loaded lever, and then you would just let it go, and it would kind of tick away like a little stopwatch and eventually return to the 12 o'clock position. And once it hit that starting point, it would trigger the shutter. So depending on how much time you needed to run in front of the camera, that's how far you would crank the lever over. So anyway, I know that sounds pretty primitive these days if you've never handled a film camera before, but that's the way we used to handle a delayed shutter. Well, I really like the fact that Fuji introduced this lever to their cameras. I think it's really ingenious. What you can do is you can press once to bring up a custom function, or twice. And then you can do that in both directions. So this little lever alone allows you to have 4 custom functions assigned to it. And there's also a button here in the middle that you can press that can be assigned another function. And we're going to get to that in a second. So I have mine set to where when I pull on the lever, it will select the various digital zooms. So the way that looks is, if I have my camera set up and then I'm now pulling, so this is no digital zoom. I pull it once, that's the medium digital zoom. I pull it again, you can see that it goes to the small. So that's the longest simulated focal length. And then when I pull it one more time, it just goes back to the 15 millimeters. Aloha, future editor here. I noticed while editing this section of the video that I was using file size and focal length somewhat interchangeably, so I know that's confusing. I made this table and just kind of wanted to flesh that out a bit. So in the video you can see I'm using a 15 millimeter lens. Normally I convert everything into full frame equivalents. I'm not going to do that this time because I don't want to add to the confusion or frankly the math. So when shooting with no digital zoom, you are using the full focal length. So in this example again, it's 15 millimeters. And then you're also getting the full size resolution, which is 40 millimeters in the X-E5. Now when I pull that lever once, it introduces a 1.4 time crop, and that's labeled medium. And so if you take 1.4 and multiply it by 15, you get a 21 millimeter equivalent focal length. And then I believe the reason why it's called medium actually is because of the file size. So your result is between 17 to 20 megapixels, and that's really just depending on what your original focal length was. Finally, when I pull the lever the second time, that introduces a 2-time crop. Now that label is small. In our example here, 2 times 15 is 30, so I have a 30 millimeter equivalent focal length. And then the reason why it's labeled small is because of the file size. So at 2-time crop, you're getting a picture with anywhere between 8 to 10 megapixels. Anyway, I hope that clears that up. If you have any questions about the digital zoom, just please put them in the comments and I will respond. Now on the other hand, I'm going to say push. So when I push the lever, so that's towards the film simulation dial, that brings up the aspect ratio menu. So if I want to see certain crops in camera, I can go ahead and change the aspect ratio here. Now I know you can do that of course in post-processing, but for me I actually like to see what the product will look like. So for instance, I'm shooting for Instagram and I want more of a squarish aspect ratio. I might choose this 4:5 or 4:3, and then you can see how the aspect ratio changes on screen. Now we said we would talk a little bit about the button here. This is another feature that I really like. I have that set to turn on facial recognition. So my finger's on it now, and then you can see when I press it, it says face detection off, face detection on. And you notice I don't have anything selected for the eye. And that's just because I found that Fujifilm's eye detection still isn't very reliable, so it tends to hunt if you turn that on. And I'm happy for it just to find a face. Now let's talk about the dials. If you're not familiar with the front and back dial, they also have two functions. So you can press them in to toggle between settings, and then you can rotate them to make a selection. And what's really nice about Fujifilm is that there are an ample number of dials, right? So you have the front dial, you have a rear dial, then you have the exposure compensation dial, and of course the shutter speed dial. We'll talk about the film simulation dial in a moment, but as far as being able to set shutter speed, aperture, ISO, you can assign them essentially to these two dials, just depending on your preference. Now, since I am using a prime lens with no aperture dial, I have the front dial set to select aperture. So when I press it in, you can see that by rotating the dial, I'm changing the aperture setting. Now, you can also see if I press it a second time, it brings up the shutter speed. So SS is the shutter speed. Now, that dial will also allow me to adjust shutter speed if I put this on T. So you can see now that it's moving the shutter speed. However, to adjust shutter speed, I prefer just using this top dial. So I can see the shutter speed at a glance, versus looking at the screen down here. Now, speaking of top dials, I love when a camera has a dedicated exposure compensation dial. However, I actually don't use this one. I set it to C, and then I use the smaller back dial to dial in exposure compensation. So if you see the scale here, I'm dialing in exposure compensation using this back wheel. For me, it's just much easier to turn this wheel than it is to turn this one. Although this does have a nice tactile feel to it, so you can hear the detents and you can actually feel them as well. So I guess that's really just a matter of preference. And then I have this single top button set to activate my stored film simulations. I purchased a film sim pack from Herzog. I'll put his Instagram here. So I purchased this film sim pack and I actually programmed it into the camera. And how I call that up is, again, using this top button here. So you can see I'm going to press it now and it says select custom function. Now there's off, which we're going to use when we use the baked in Fujifilm simulations. But otherwise, C1 through 5, those are the film simulations that I purchased. I particularly like this Kodak Gold film sim. I used this sim while shooting the Hotel Sorrento in Seattle, so I'll put a link to that video in the description. And I also used that film sim when I was shooting an adapted Canon zoom lens at Magic Island. I love the way those pictures came out, so I'll go ahead and put a link to that video as well. And of course, in slot number 6, I have to have Reggie's Portra. Okay, now you notice I'm going to put this back to off so I can show you the final dial that I use. So when I want to use the baked in simulations, I go ahead and use the dedicated dial. Now, I know a lot of Fuji film shooters will probably have the same issue with this that I have. To me, a lot of times when I reach over, and it did it just then, reach over to adjust this dial, it does kind of blank out the back of the screen. So that's a little bit of a pain. But it's nice overall to have this dedicated film simulation dial. I know that caused a lot of controversy. Some people thought maybe it should have been an ISO dial, but I do like to have that one there. And lucky for me, all of the film simulations that I like they do have a dedicated slot on this dial. Alright, let's go through the dial here and I can tell you what my favorite film simulations are. This is classic Chrome, Astia, Velvia, and Provia. Those are all definitely my favorite film simulations. And then finally, my last one that I love is the Acros. And in fact, if you saw my unboxing video for this, I actually traded in my X-T1 for my X-T3 just so that I could have that Acros film simulation. Now if you notice, there's one aspect of the exposure triangle that we haven't talked about, and it's ISO. Fuji handles ISO differently than any other camera system I've owned. Usually there's just a straight auto setting where the camera decides which auto to use. But in Fuji cameras, there are 3 auto ISO settings, just auto 1, 2, and 3. But it's not strictly just an auto setting. So if we go into this menu, for each of these auto settings, you have to define a minimum ISO, a maximum ISO, and then the minimum shutter speed before it begins to move the ISO up. So that's a lot different than my other cameras where you simply just say, oh, auto ISO. Adjust the ISO as needed for a proper exposure. Now, I know that some people do like having 3 auto ISO settings. So you can have one for fast action, you can have one just for everyday shooting, and then you can have one for night. But I don't prefer to do that. So usually what I do is I just set the ISO to auto 1 and I just choose the minimum available ISO and the maximum. So I have the full range of ISOs available. And generally for the minimal shutter speed, I put it down to about 1/60th. I generally don't shoot a lot of fast action things because, again, just shooting landscapes or shooting seascapes. But when I'm shooting people, just candid shots, I mean, they're never moving faster than 1/160 can capture. So there won't be a lot of blur. Also, the one reason why I don't really worry too much about ISO is because the minimum value is affected by your dynamic range setting. And since I'm using custom film sims, some of them depend on a specific dynamic range, whether it's dynamic range, 100, 200, or 400. And so those film simulations affect your minimum ISO anyway. So again, I really don't worry too much about my ISO settings. Okay, the final button I want to talk about is the Q button. Here on the side, Q for quick. I do actually like that it's offset and kind of a little bit smaller than the other buttons so that you don't accidentally push it while you're taking pictures. Now on my quick menu, I do have flash compensation as one of my tiles. I do very occasionally like to use flash. And so for all my cameras actually, I do generally tend to set my quick menu so that I have access to this flash compensation. I found with some cameras, like the flash compensation is really buried very deeply in the menus and it's kind of hard to get to. Now, of course, a lot of modern flashes make that very easy by having a flash compensation dial built into the flash. Well, that's it. That's how I have my Fujifilm X-E5 set up. If you stayed till the end of the video, mahalo, I really appreciate it. If you have any questions regarding any of the settings discussed, please let me know. Also, if you have any suggestions for changes, please let me know. Finally, please subscribe and stay tuned for more camera content. Mahalo.